Hi everyone, and welcome to the final lecture of Biomaterials 1. This lecture is about regulation of medical devices. So you've invented a great material, you started a company, and now you are ready to get permission from the FDA to market your device. All right, so this stuff can be pretty confusing. So the purpose of this lecture is sort of just tell you the basics of the FDA and some helpful tips for navigating the regulatory pathways, that in which you have to deal with the FDA. So just pure practical advice for when you get to this point. So this is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the history of the FDA, which I think is actually helpful in understanding why there's all the requirements that there are. But most important for the engineer is how medical devices are classified by the FDA and how does that determine your regulatory pathway that you have to follow. And we'll talk a little bit about clinical trials and what happens post-approval afterwards. So the FDA is notorious for having a bad website, and so I have tried to help all the websites where I took this information from at the bottom of the slide so that you can go directly to that. But if you need to find more information about any of these topics, I would recommend Googling it with the term FDA in the search term, as opposed to trying to navigate the FDA website, which it's very convoluted and it's hard to find anything once you're in there. But if you Google, it'll take you to a very informative website. Okay, so there's good web pages, they're just hard to find. All right. So basics of the FDA. The FDA. So this is taken directly from their mission statement. The FDA is responsible for protecting the public health by assuring the safety, effectiveness, and security of drugs, including human and veterinary drugs, vaccines, and other biologic products like antibodies or proteins that you might administer. Also medical devices, which is probably most important for the biomaterials engineer. Also the food supply, cosmetics, dietary supplements, and products that give off radiation. So that is extremely broad, and it seems like there's a lot that the FDA is responsible for. But I kind of want to talk a little bit more about what they specifically regulate, because that's kind of misleading once you look into it. So first of all, FDA approval is required to market drugs, biologics, and medical devices. It's actually not even required just to make them or test them. And we're going to go into that a little bit later. But this is all about marketing. So if you're a company and you're planning to make money off of anything, it needs to, that falls into one of those categories, you need to consult the FDA. I think it's interesting what the FDA does not approve, because there's a lot of myths that come into information about the FDA. Like, for example, the FDA does not approve food or cosmetics. So this was really confusing when I was first looking at this, because it says in the mission statement, we protect public health by assuring safety of food and cosmetics. And then if you click on what does it not approve, it says we do not approve food and cosmetics. So that can be confusing. But it turns out that what you do have to get approved is a food additive. That requires approval. And also FDA field investigators will go out and inspect food manufacturers and companies, but they don't certify the manufacturers and they don't approve anything that they manufacture. So that's sort of like it's not an approval process like we're going to go through with these devices and drugs. Also, dietary supplements are not required to be approved, there's still a lot of controversy and debate surrounding that, because they make a lot of medical claims, such as improves memory, weight loss, joint health. You see all of these things on dietary supplements which seem medical, right? But the FDA does not approve them, because that's not really what they are. They're just dietary supplements that are not approved of that. So there's still a lot of debate surrounding whether or not the FDA should approve that, and should they regulate the labels that they say, and it's still not known what's the ideal situation there. The FDA does not have anything to do with restaurants or grocery stores, which I think is interesting, because I always heard a rumor that like the creamery at Penn State is not FDA approved. Like, the ice cream is so bad for you, it's not FDA approved. But no ice cream is FDA approved. That's not under the purview of the FDA. Restaurants and grocery stores are usually inspected by local authorities, and hopefully the creamery at Penn State is inspected by local agencies, but it's not the FDA. The FDA definitely does not, they don't even inspect meat and poultry at all because that's regulated by the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, so that's not under the purview of the FDA. Labels that go on food, like nutrition facts, that's not something the FDA deals with, even though they deal with labels for drugs and medical devices a lot. And interestingly, they do not regulate compounded drugs, which means a compounded drug are drugs that are mixed by smaller pharmaceutical companies specifically for a patient. So a physician might write a prescription for a patient-specific set of drugs because maybe they're sensitive to a certain preservative, so they can't have a brand name or they can't have a generic form of the drug. So a pharmacist will mix up another drug, and that's called compounding. And this recently has gotten a lot of attention because we very recently had a meningitis outbreak where there was fungal contamination in these compounded drugs. And then the FDA went out and looked at it, and they found that there was terrible working conditions. It wasn't really clean, and it's under inspection now, but that's because there was fungus growing in these drugs, and they're never regulated by the FDA. So that's actually, a point of debate too. Like, why aren't they regulated by the FDA? They're drugs being given to people. If the Food and Drug Administration is not going to regulate it, who's going to? Okay, so I think that's interesting. There's some more myths that are really pervasive. A big myth is that FDA tests medical devices. They do not. Companies test their own medical devices, and then they have to submit a really long application to the FDA proving that they tested it and how they tested it and proving that it's safe. But the FDA does not do any tests itself. FDA does not regulate medical procedures. So medical procedures are up to the surgeon or to the physician to kind of do whatever they want. They can even use whatever product they want, whether or not it is FDA approved for that specific purpose. The FDA wants physicians to be able to do whatever they want, and they say it's not their area of expertise to tell a physician how to do their job. Another myth that all approved devices have been tested in heavily controlled, randomized, multi-center clinical trials. That would be ideal, but it's not the case. And actually, only about half of devices are tested in clinical trials. And we'll talk a little bit more, and the difference is because the pathways that you have to. First, one of the differences is different pathways that you can follow depending on the characteristics of your device, and another one is that the FDA is under a lot of pressure to fast-track products to the market, and so there's a lot of pressure to sometimes accept data that's not as ideal as you would want it to be. So we're not going to talk today about the controversy surrounding the FDA. One of the things I do want to talk about in this class is is the FDA too strict? Because there's a lot of data that say they're too strict, and there's all these products that are they're being used in Brazil and Europe and Asia, and they're saving lives, but they're not approved in America. And then you have medical tourism, where people try to go to other countries to have surgical procedures done. Clearly, this is not something that we want. But at the same time, there's data that devices that the FDA approves that don't get as much scrutiny as they normally would give are often the ones that are recalled. So I think it's important to look at all the ways that the FDA does everything and figure out what's the best way to approach it. Okay, another myth, all FDA-approved devices are approved for reimbursement by insurance companies. This is something that's really important in the United States, where insurance reimbursement is one of the biggest factors that a medical device manufacturer thinks about when they're taking their product to the FDA, or when they're just investing in R&D. So usually insurance companies will say that they'll approve for reimbursement things shortly after they're approved by the FDA, but that's not always the case. I sort of just mentioned this, but another myth is that a device that's used in Europe or another country will automatically be used under approval in the United States, and that's definitely not true. The biggest myth is that physicians can only use products for which they are approved. So if you have like a vascular graft that is approved for a small diameter, it's not approved for a large diameter graft. But then the physician says, well, this is a child. Their large vascular graft is actually quite small, so I'm going to use a small diameter. It's not FDA approved for that at all. But the surgeon's actually allowed to do that because they are legally allowed to use their best medical judgment to make any decision that they want. That's called off-label use, and it's perfectly legal. The doctors have their own problem. If they do something that's crazy and they use something that's not FDA approved, they have to answer to themselves. That's why we have malpractice insurance, and that's why we have a very litigious society at all. But off-label use is definitely legal. However, companies cannot promote off-label use. So when you get something approved by the FDA, it is approved for a specific indication, and if you get caught promoting an off-label use to a doctor, if you get caught telling a doctor, oh, it's only approved for lower spine fusion, but you should really use it for the neck fusion because it works great for that, that's absolutely illegal, and they will get in tons of trouble. And anytime you hear about the trouble in the news of these medical devices, that is usually why. They got caught promoting something off-label when they weren't allowed. So that's really important. Okay, so in history of the FDA, it was founded in the mid-1800s. In 1862, it had a name that was similar to the FDA within the U.S. Department of Agriculture, but it wasn't until 1930 that the FDA was known as it is. I think it was 1930 that it was incorporated into the Department of Health and Human Services, where it still remains today. Some important laws. In 1906, they passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, which prohibited interstate commerce in adulterated food. So that was actually the first law that started regulating food, and I guess that was just food, but no, food and drugs. Another big piece of legislation was the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938, which was following 100 deaths in 1937, mostly of children, of tainted elixir of sulfonilamide, which actually had poison in it, and people died. And so that prompted Congress to pass this act, which required safety testing before anyone could start marketing a drug or food. And so that was really important. For our purposes, the 1976 Medical Device Amendment, it was extremely important, and so were these other acts that I'm going to go through in more detail here. So the Medical Device Amendment of 1976 is extremely important. In the early 1900s, medical devices were not as sophisticated as they are now. So medical devices that are still considered medical devices by the FDA were like stethoscopes, scalpels, a face mask, and these are definitely still considered medical devices by the FDA, but there's very little risk involved with them. But then, later in the 1900s, by 1917, the FDA notes this on their website that I have the history link down at the bottom there. By 1917, the market was flooded with fraudulent medical devices that were dangerous and didn't do what they said they were going to do. So we had nose straighteners, height-stretching machines, rubber applicators to cure prostate gland disorders, and none of these actually worked. And the FDA knew that they needed to do something about it, and so they started trying to push Congress to make some laws about regulation, and Congress couldn't agree, which never happens. But in the 1960s and 70s, the FDA actually took it upon themselves to create their own inventory of medical devices that are currently on the market, and they classified them according to the risk. And they made this proposal about what they were going to do, and they brought it to Congress, and they said, this is what the law should be. And Congress said, okay, yeah, that actually looks good, so we'll make that a law. And it's the 1976 Medical Device Amendment. So it distinguished between drugs and medical devices, first of all. So the way they did that was they said drugs actually cause a chemical reaction in the body. They're metabolized by the body. But devices are some other, there's another device that has a function in the body that is not through chemical action. So they classified the devices that were already available according to risk, with class 1 devices being the lowest risk, class 3 devices being the highest risk. And they established regulations for good manufacturing practices, and also some other safety testing that they had to do in order to be approved by the FDA. And the reason why this year was so important is because now, or actually post this, so 1976, the later half of the year, any devices that went up for approval that were substantially equivalent to something that was already around before 1976 can be fast-tracked to the market. And that makes sense, right? Because they were already tested on the market, so their safety could be assumed more than something that's brand new. So So that's really important. Anything that was already pre-1976 could go through an easier pathway. So things that were kind of risky, that are actually very risky, but are included in that include like pacemakers, implantable pacemakers, and a lot of other implants. But now this same idea is extended to any device that you're going to try to get approval for if it's already legally, if it's substantially equivalent to something that's already legally available on the market, you can fast track the product to the market as well. But this year, 1976, is really important because that was like the cutoff originally. Okay. Jeez. Here we go. Okay. More important laws. In 1990, the Safe Medical Devices Act, that required healthcare facilities, so hospitals, nursing homes, anything that could be considered to provide healthcare, they required them to report to the FDA any illnesses or injuries that might have resulted from a medical device. And that was really important because the physicians and the healthcare providers are the ones that are actually monitoring the device after it gets FDA approval. So let's say a device gets FDA approval, but it still causes serious injuries. The FDA needs to be able to recall that device and do it from a coordinated effort. So that was a really important law. In 2002, the Medical Device User Fee and Modernization Act, this is when the FDA began charging fees to companies for applying for FDA approval. And it's actually kind of recent that that happened, considering, but so originally it was free to apply to the FDA for approval, but I guess just so many companies were applying that the FDA started charging fees. And that allows them to hire more people and utilize more resources, so hopefully more devices get approved. But small businesses can get a waiver so that they don't have to deal with that. And it's not a law, but it's a Supreme Court decision, 2008 Regal versus Medtronic. This guy, Charles Regal, had a balloon angioplasty catheter. Well, the balloon burst during application into his artery, and he survived it, but he had severe trauma and injuries the rest of his life, and so he sued Medtronic, and he said this was a defective device, suing for damages. So the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Medtronic because they said that the device was FDA approved, so the FDA approved it and said it was safe and effective, so Medtronic can't be held responsible anymore for something the FDA approved and went through this strict, stringent approval process. They should be protected from liability at that point. So that's effectively current law today, that if you get approved by the FDA, you're essentially protected from liability. Okay, more on that later. So the FDA is set up into 4 offices: Office of Foods, Operations, Medical Products and Tobacco, and Global Regulatory Operations and Policy. So then the Office of Medical Products and Tobacco is further separated into 9 centers. The centers that we care most about as biomaterials engineers are CDER, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, CBER, especially the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, because that's where medical devices come in, and the Office of Combination Products, which is if you have a combination of drugs, biologics, and or medical devices, that's a combination product. You can imagine why it's called that. So for biomaterials, these are the 2 centers that we deal with most, because a medical device has always been reviewed by the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, but as we start getting fancier, like having drugs or biologics coming out of the device, or if we include cells as in a tissue engineering product, that would be a combination product, and this office is actually fairly new, and it's designed to sort of coordinate efforts between the other centers to figure out how does approval work for a combination product. What is a medical device? Anything intended for the diagnosis, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease whose primary action is not through metabolism in the body. So it should not be chemical action, it should be purely for something else. So I think it's interesting that diagnostic devices are also considered medical devices. So if you have like a pregnancy test, that is a medical device. And actually, interestingly, that's a class 2 device because the risk is higher, I guess, if it is defective than a device that would maybe not have such a important consequence. Okay, so that's a medical device. The classification is very important because that determines the pathways that you have to follow in order to get FDA approval. So the classification depends on, first and foremost, the risk, whether if, lower risk is class 1, higher risk class 3, but also the intended use, indications for use, and the primary mode of action. The mode of action meaning if it's a drug, it's going to be classified as a drug, and if it's a biologic, it's probably going to be a biologic. Okay, but device classification, so devices can be class 1, 2, or 3, and that depends on their risk mostly. But there's some significant differences that happen if your device is classified as one of these 3 levels of risk. So if it's a class 1 device, it's pretty low risk. They usually are exempt from regulation because you're talking about like surgical gloves. That's not, actually surgical gloves might be class 2. But like a scalpel is class 1 because it's sort of up to the surgeon to control that. So class 1 devices have general controls, so that includes like good manufacturing practices, but you don't have to approve like a biocompatibility test. You definitely don't have to do clinical trials. And then they're generally exempt from regulation, although there are some exceptions. Class 2 devices have general controls, but also special controls. We're going to talk about what's included in special controls in a little bit. And the pathway that you have to go through if you are a Class 2 device, if you're trying to get approval for a Class 2 device, is called Premarket notification, or 510K. So it's more commonly referred to as 510K. And that's actually not approval per se, it's actually clearance. So we're going to talk more about that in a little bit. But if you have a class 3 device, you have to do general controls, special controls, and clinical trials. And then you go through a pathway that's called pre-market approval, or PMA. And that is absolutely the strictest, most stringent method of getting approval, and that's the one that protects you from liability litigation later. So class 1 devices are medical devices that present the lowest risk, and therefore they merit the least regulation. That's actually the definition from the FDA. It's just all about risk. Elastic bandages, gloves, surgical instruments. So these are things that if they're defective, they're probably not going to hurt anyone that bad. They account for 47% of medical devices, so most devices that exist don't even have to go through any regulation at all. They're class 1. 95% are exempt from either pre-market notification or approval. So 5% of these class 1 devices will have to go through the 510K pathway, but none will have to go through through pre-market approval. And they're all subject to general controls. So they will have to register with the FDA that they are making a class 1 medical device. They have to list their medical device with the FDA so that the FDA can kind of keep tabs on it. And they have to. The FDA will inspect their facilities and make sure they're going through GMP, and they're subject to labeling regulations. But other than that, they don't really have to deal with the FDA that much, and that they don't have to submit any heavy package. Okay, class 2 devices are slightly more risk, so they're classified just on the fact that they're more risk than class 1. Devices for which general controls alone cannot assure their safety and effectiveness. This is 43% of medical devices. So the vast majority, 90% of medical devices, are either class 1 or class 2 and can get to the market really quickly. I think the FDA has like 75 days to respond after you submit your application for the pre-market notification. It's only 10% of devices that are class 3 that have to go through this long process. But class 2 devices are just subject to general and special controls. They usually do not require clinical studies in humans, but there are some that do have to. Examples of class 2 devices are powered wheelchairs, infusion pumps, pregnancy kits. So if they failed or they malfunctioned, there would be a serious risk of injury or harm to the patient. Interestingly, orthopedic implants are actually class 2 devices, which I think is kind of surprising because you would think that would be some pretty serious injury if it failed. But I think they're actually declassified from class 3 to class 2 because they've been around for so long. Okay, so the regulatory approval pathway that you follow if it's a Class 2 device is the pre-market notification or 510K. So this is really important. You will have to show in your PMN, your 510K application, that you are following special controls. That is that you have to prove the product is effective using performance standards. You have to show biocompatibility of the device, usually if that's applicable. And then you're required to, there's post-market surveillance where the manufacturer is still responsible for the device and you're required to notify the FDA if anything goes wrong. Okay, Class 3 devices are those that support or sustain life or that are just really risky, and if they fail, they would cause significant injury or death. This is 10% of medical devices, so these are your most serious medical devices, replacing heart valves, brain implants, just anything that would, it's entirely based on risk, so if it would be very dangerous, that's Class 3. So they require clinical trials. There are some that don't, so that's why I say generally require, but you can assume that you will have to do clinical trials and you'll have to get pre-market approval in order to have permission to market the device. Unless they are substantially equivalent to a device that is already on the market, especially if it was before 1976. That already available device is called a predicate, and then you can go through the 510K pathway, so it's a lot faster than the PMA and a lot easier to do. So devices that are substantially equivalent to pre-1976 devices are like implantable pacemakers and dental implants. So those oral, and also some bone void fillers. So, but in general, Class 3 devices have to go through the PMA. Combination products are what they sound like, a combination of a medical device with a drug or a biologic. These are always Class 3, and there's a quote on the FDA website which I think is interesting. Because combination products involve components that would normally be regulated under different types of authorities, they raise challenging challenges. So the FDA is basically acknowledging that they are not quite prepared to deal with these products yet, and they just recently, in the last couple of years, started the Office of Combination Products, but there's still, the Office of Combination Products still regulates these devices through one of the other offices primarily. So the Office of Combination Products is in charge of saying that, okay, this is going to be regulated through the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, or through the drug, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. They're still not controlled primarily by the Office of Combination Products, but that is probably changing soon. And examples are if you have like a cell-based scaffold, apligraph for venous leg ulcers, drug-eluting stents, or medical devices that release drugs. Okay, so this flowchart is designed to make it all more clear, but I just want to walk you through it. So basically, something I'm going to talk about next is that you have your medical device, and the first question should actually be, does it benefit fewer than 4,000 people annually in the U.S.? And if it does, then you can really fast track to the market using a humanitarian device exemption. And then that doesn't even require clinical trials. But let's assume that we're not doing that because we're a big company and we only care about our post-market returns. So does your medical device contain drug or biologic? If it doesn't, what about the risk? Does it result in, if it failed, would it result in significant injury or death? No? Okay, it's a Class 2 device, and you can do a 510K and get your product on the market in a couple months. Okay, it doesn't contain drug or biologic, but it would result in significant injury or death. Yes, that's a Class 3 device. Is it substantially equivalent to a legally marketed device? Yes. Okay, do a 510K, it's quick. If it's not, what's the primary mode of action? If it doesn't contain a drug or biologic, then you'll go through, it's probably a scaffold or some other device. And you'll go through clinical trials using one of these forms that you have to submit that I'll go through a little bit later, and then you'll do a pre-market approval. Okay, if it contains a drug or a biologic, then it's a combination product. What's the primary mode of action? If it's a drug, you will have to submit an investigational new drug form, do clinical trials, and then a new drug application. If it's a biologic or a protein, like an antibody or a protein, you'll also submit an investigational new drug application, but then it's called a biologic license application. And that's really similar to a drug application, but it's got a different name, and it's through a different center. So that's what you have to do for class 3 devices. So in this stage, these are applications, INDs or IDEs, investigational device exemption, that you will submit to get permission from the FDA to conduct clinical trials. And I think it's interesting that you do conduct clinical trials before getting approval from the FDA. And the reason why you do these clinical trials is in order to build support for the approval. So the FDA wants you to consult them, and they want to, sometimes they even have to approve your clinical trials, but then that's the data that you use in support of your application. And we do talk, I do talk about that a little bit more later, so hang on. Okay, just one more slide about the humanitarian device exemption. The FDA developed this as an incentive to get companies to develop treatments that would otherwise not, where the R&D costs would exceed market returns. It's extremely expensive to conduct clinical trials and to put together the data you need for a pre-market approval application. So you don't have to do that if you have a humanitarian device exemption. But you have to prove that you're not going to kill all the people and that the benefit outweighs the risk. So that's kind of interesting. Okay, so now we're going to go into a little bit more details about these different regulatory pathways. So if it's a class 1 device and it's exempt, so if it's a class 1 device and it's one of those 95% of class 1 devices that does not require any regulation by the FDA, you don't have to get FDA approval or clearance, but you do have to register the device with the FDA. So manual stethoscopes, thermometers, bedpans. So these are medical devices that have almost no risk. Class 2 devices, manufacturers are required under Section 510K of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to notify FDA of their intent to market the device. That's why it's called a 510K, because it's that section of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So that it's also called a pre-market notification, or PMN. So class 1, no approval necessary. Class 2, 510K. Class 3, pre-market approval, PMA, unless it's substantially equivalent to a device that's already on the market or before 1976, and then you can use the 510K pathway as well. But the majority of class 2 devices will do the 510K, and the majority of class 3 will do a PMA. Okay, so what is required in the 510K pathway? This is used for class 2 devices, or if you alter a class 3 device so that it's already been on the market for a while, but you're just altering it, so you can sometimes submit a 510K. Other times you have to do a whole new PMA. But the biggest thing is you have to demonstrate product effectiveness and safety. So it's always a good idea to use standards, like from the American Society for Testing of Materials, now called ASTM International, or the International Organization for Standards, or ISO. So they publish these documents that provide requirements, specs, guidelines, or other characteristics that you can consistently use to compare your product to others on the market, or just to do a good job testing the material. So ISO has over 19,000 published standards for testing of materials, and ASTM has over 12,000. So you can pretty much find a standard for any test that you want to do, and you should, and the FDA wants you to do that so that the approval can go more smoothly. So by the way, if you talk to anybody who has a lot of experience in getting products from research to the market, the number one piece of advice they give you is to involve the FDA early and get their advice on how are you going to develop your product from this stage, so just testing it and its product effectiveness, through the design of clinical trials, and then when you finally actually start submitting things to the FDA. So if you involve the FDA early and you do everything that they're going to want to see in these huge 1,000-page applications, then you're going to have an easier time of getting things to the market. It'll be better for everyone involved. It's more efficient. It's cheaper. So being aware of what the FDA is looking for is really important for saving a lot of time and money. Okay, what if you have a tissue-engineered product? Those are weird. They're new. We don't know what to do with them. The ASTM and ISO actually do have standards for them. An example of the TEMP standards from ASTM is a guide for characterization and testing of alginates as starting materials intended for use in biomedical applications. So there's I think there's 20 that are contained within that subject. ISO has a bunch called tissue engineered medical products. They're in progress. And there is a multi-agency tissue engineering science working group that takes the FDA, NASA, NSF, NIH. There's like 11 different federal agencies that are all working together to try to figure out how to regulate tissue engineered products and make sure that they get onto the market. Because right now the success rate of tissue engineering products from going from development to the market is extremely low. And that's a problem because we know that there is a lot of potential there, so the government agencies are trying to figure out how to make it work better. So that's in progress. Okay, but biocompatibility testing is one of the tests that is usually required for Class 2 devices. Generally, this would be in whatever thing it makes sense for the device. So if it's going to be implanted, you have to do some implantation studies in animals to make sure that it's biocompatible. ISO has a lot of standards called the 10993 that contain different standards you can use, like selection of tests for interactions with blood, toxicity, local effects after implantation. So you can just go on ISO's website and browse the and they just give you the protocol, they give you acceptable standards that other products in the field are already using. And the FDA has their own flow chart that's even less helpful than mine is. I'm going to zoom in on the top part. So if you have a new material and you think you might have to do biocompatibility testing, you can follow this. So they say start up there. Does the device contact the body directly or indirectly? No. Okay, good. You met your biocompatibility requirements. It's a very helpful aspect of the flow chart. Is the material same as in a marketed device? So if you have a predicate that it's really similar to, yes. Is it the same process to manufacture it? Yes. Is it the same chemicals? Yes. Same body contact, same sterilization method. If you didn't change any of these things, you don't have to do any further biocompatibility. It's met. But if you changed any of these things, or if you have a similar material that something's legally on the market, but you changed any of these important things, then you have to say, do you have acceptable justification or test data to show that it's biocompatible? That's where you would want to do the standards testing. If so, then you're good. If not, another issue is the device a polymer? There's all new rules for polymers. Is it a metal? No. Is it a metal or ceramic? Yes. Does it contain any of these leaching ions, lead, nickel, cadmium? No? Okay, then you're good. Biocompatibility requirements met. If it is a polymer, you have to do specific toxicology profiles. You have to go to the master file. You have to have a master file that has acceptable data. You have to consult modified ISO matrix for suggested tests. You just have to do a lot of tests if it's a little bit different. So you'll go through ISO and ASTM and see what sort of files they have for you, what sort of standards. You'll talk to a toxicologist, and then only then are your biocompatibility requirements met. So in the 510, so this is true for PMAs as well, but at this point, if you've met your biocompatibility requirements, you are generally ready to submit the 510K, and you can get clearance from the FDA. Okay. If it is a Class 3 device, you have to do a premarket approval or a PMA. And this application is the body of evidence that the manufacturer assembles the device is safe and effective for its intended use. So you have to do the non-clinical laboratory studies that we just talked about, including proving that it's effective and that it is biocompatible. And you also have to do clinical trials. So what are some more details about the non-clinical laboratory studies? So product manufacturer, where do you get your material sourcing, the processing, you have to prove that you're following GMPs, lot to lot consistency, you have to, if it's degrading, you have to do studies of that. Then you have to do your biocompatibility, you have to address shelf life, wear. Okay, so that's sort of the same for the 510K pathway as well. But if you're going to do clinical trials in humans, which you must for the PMA, this is where you're evaluating safety and effectiveness. You're finding out if there's any adverse events or complications. You have to find device failures. You have to evaluate replacements. You also have to be in consultation with the FDA about what patients you'll use and what complaints you might have. Statistical analysis is really important because you're going to have a lot of patients, and it's going to require extremely complicated statistics to prove whether or not anything that happened could be chalked up to chance or if it's real. Okay, so 510K and PMA are pretty different, so I just want to summarize what the differences are. For the 510K, first of all, it's clearance. It's not approval. So it is not legal to, if you have a device that you cleared through the 510K pathway, it's not legal to advertise it as FDA approved because it has not gone through the stringent approval process. If you did go through the PMA, then it's approved. It's legal. 510K is for Class 2 devices and any Class 3 that are substantially equivalent to a legally marketed device. Pre-market approval is most Class 3 devices. So the 510K requires demonstration of product effectiveness and also biocompatibility, and a PMA requires all that and more, including clinical trials. And the 510K usually does not require pre-market surveillance, but you have to just consult with the FDA because that's not necessarily true. The pre-market approval, it will always require post-market surveillance, which we'll talk more about in a couple slides. Okay, so there are advantages and disadvantages to the 510K or PMA, and I think this is important to point out because on the surface it may seem like the 510K is better because it's faster and cheaper, and that is a really big advantage of the 510K. However, it's got some significant disadvantages in that it can really limit your marketing claims because you can't say to your physician, this is FDA approved, your commercials can't say it's FDA approved. And you have no data to convince physicians it's going to work because you weren't required to do those clinical trials. And you have no product liability protection. So God forbid something does go wrong on a massive scale, you will be sued. And you have no protection there. On the other hand, if you set aside the time and the cost to go through the PMA, not like you have a choice, the FDA tells you whether or not you have to do it. You go through it. It's a significant clinical burden, but it proves clinical utility. It confirms the safety and efficacy. It protects you from liability litigation. And you can make the desired marketing claims that you want to, which is that it's safe and effective and FDA approved. So they both have their advantages and disadvantages. Okay. So a little bit more about clinical trials. I talked earlier about the investigational device exemption or the investigational new drug application. So these are only required for research in support of a PMA application. So it's interesting that you don't actually have to get approval for the device unless you're going to apply for a PMA. So if you're testing a device in humans just for the sake of testing, which is probably would not be approved by an IRB because it's unethical to just do tests without any chance for this becoming like something that will help people. But it's only required in support of the PMA. So I keep talking about the IRB. The IRB is Institutional Review Board, so every place that does clinical trials, so it's usually affiliated with universities, but it doesn't even have to be, has an institutional review board that needs to approve human trials. And this is to protect the patient rights, especially to make sure that you've achieved informed consent and also to protect their privacy, to make sure that everything you're doing is safe and doesn't cause any undue harm. So that's really important. But these mechanisms to test devices before approval allows the patients to access these new devices for the purpose of research and collection of safety data before the FDA has approved it. So that's really an important mechanism. And also you need it in order to get approved. So, okay, so I mentioned earlier that you should involve the FDA early in your testing so that you don't do any tests that were unnecessary and so that you make sure that you don't have to repeat any tests because you forgot some controls that the FDA is going to require you to have. So the FDA puts out some documents called Guidance for Industry, and these are some of the links that you'll find on the Guidance for Industry page. So there's all sorts of advice that they put out. They're trying to be more transparent. So there's general good clinical practice, which helps in the design of clinical trials. There's institutional review boards and informed consent and information that you need to know about how to deal with IRBs and why informed consent is important. And then there's just advice on testing of drugs and biologics, medical devices. What about requirements of manufacturing, and also electronic data and how to manage all your electronic data. So the FDA has a lot of documents out there that are designed entirely to help manufacturers of medical devices get through FDA approval smoothly. So these are just some snapshots of the table of contents of the Consolidated Guidance for Good Clinical Practice. So there's first a section on the Institutional Review Board, the IRB, and ethics. Then they talk about the investigator of the clinical trial and what qualifications they should have, how they should be complying with the protocol, randomization procedures, recording results, reports, what happens if you have to terminate a trial early, or when do you know if you have to terminate a trial early. So that's all written up. The sponsor, which is the manufacturer of the device who's paying for it, quality assurance and quality control, trial design. So there's just tons of information that is designed to help manufacturers go through this. Designing the clinical trial, from defining the trial objectives and purpose, and selecting subjects, financing. And there's also another document called Choice of Control Group and Related Issues in Clinical Trials, and this really gets into the details about how you make sure that the clinical trial is designed to give you the highest statistical power and the best results that will show whether or not the device is safe and effective. So it's really important to consult these documents before you start any clinical trials, because you don't want to have to repeat any clinical trials when you go to actually submit your PMA. Okay, so some things that go into the IDE protocol that is approved by the FDA, and what the clinical trial has to include is inclusion criteria, like what patients are you going to include in the study, how many patients are you going to have, and also calculation of statistical power. What controls, that's extremely important. Are you going to just have a no treatment control, or are you going to compare to a control that's already available on the market? What are the variables that you're going to be studying? And especially study endpoints and how you know if something worked or not. It's really important to define that in the beginning rather than making it up as you go along, which would involve a lot of bias. And then data analysis, what sort of statistics you're going to do to figure out what you need to know. So all of this is important to come up with in the beginning so that you do remove bias and you ensure that you get the cleanest data that you can out of these expensive and dangerous studies. So clinical trials, there's 3 phases, or sort of 4. So there's the pilot phase, phase 1, that's when you have less than 100 patients, a lot of times less than 20, and that's purely for safety, just to make sure that the device is safe. And then once you get past that, okay, the device is safe, then you can start trying to determine the effectiveness of the device, and that's when you'll have a few hundred patients in phase 2. And hopefully that goes well, and now you go into phase 3, you're in large clinical trials, and you have thousands of patients, and once you get effectiveness established from that many patients, that's when you can go to the FDA and submit your PMA. Whether or not the clinical trials are conducted in the U.S. is really important, because you have an easier time getting things accepted by the FDA if they are conducted in the U.S. And if they're not conducted in the U.S., then you have to prove that all the studies were conducted in accordance with the Declaration of Helsinki. So just making sure that you're protecting patients and they're getting informed consent, being ethical about everything, assuring their privacy. Okay. So you amass all this data, you did all these clinical trials, it took you 10 to 15 years and hundreds of thousands of dollars, and now you submit your package to the FDA. So what does the FDA do? Well, the Center for Devices and Radiological Health has 4 advisory committees, the Medical Devices Advisory Committee, GMP, they also regulate mammography and radiation products. For our purposes, we're talking about the Medical Devices Advisory Committee, and that consists of 18 expert advisory panels. So these are the panels that are separated into area, and these panels will receive your application, and they have to stop everything they're doing and analyze it and try to determine if the data that you submitted in this package supports the conclusion that your product is safe and effective. So the advisory panels include physicians, surgeons, scientists, engineers, at least one consumer representative and one industry representative, but that industry representative is non-voting because clearly there would be some bias there. So they review the submission, they make recommendations to the FDA about whether or not the data is sufficient to support the safety and efficacy. The FDA makes a distinction about whether or not that means a recommendation that you should approve or not approve a device. But in essence, the FDA can accept or reject the panel's recommendation, but that rarely happens that they go against what the panel says. It does happen, and it's happened recently, but usually the FDA accepts the panel's recommendations. Okay, so awesome. You got approved. You have an FDA-approved product. What happens after that? Well, there are post-approval requirements that may be a condition of the approval, and that would include like restriction of sales, oftentimes further studies that you need to do before approval kicks in, prominent labels like a black box warning that says this is extremely dangerous, take it on your own risk. And then you'll always have to do post-market surveillance, which could include device tracking. Well, it does include device tracking, adverse event reporting, and medical device reporting. So what that means is that you have to have a mechanism in place for tracking a device and making sure that it remains safe like you said that it was. So if there's an adverse event that happens, the manufacturer is required to submit notice to the FDA within 10 days of that happening. So this is where it's really important that the physicians notify the manufacturer if they find a malfunction in the device or something, because they're the ones implanting it, or working with it. So it's really important that they report to the manufacturer, and then the manufacturer is legally obligated to report this to the FDA. And it's a similar concept for medical device reporting. That they're required to report to the FDA whenever there is serious injury caused by a malfunctioning device that is not included in their labels. Okay. So speaking of labels, labels are a really important part of what the FDA regulates, and that is to make sure that patients and consumers are properly warned of risks that are associated with drugs and devices. Of course, there's risks associated with the devices, and it's the patient's right to know what they are. So labeling includes precautions, warnings, and indications for use. So that's really important that you know what it was approved for, and if you're going to use it for something it's not approved for, then you must know about it. Products are approved for specific indications, so it won't just be bone repair. It'll be, long bone void filler in the tibia or something. We already talked about off-label use and how that is legal, that you can use products for something other than what they're approved for. The FDA has a whole series of web pages about how they're concerned with off-label use. They respect the physician's medical judgment, and they're not going to try to do the physician's job. But obviously there's safety concerns with that, since the safety of that was never proven. And I don't think this is as big a deal as the safety concerns, but there's the possibility that would diminish incentive to seek FDA approval if you can still make money on your product without it being FDA approved. That is illegal, so if you get caught trying to make money off your product before it's approved, you'll be heavily prosecuted for it. But it might be an incentive for you to not even try to get FDA approval if you're already making money on it anyway before it's approved. And that there's serious impediments to insurance reimbursement, which is very important in this country where everything is about insurance reimbursement. So your insurance company will probably not reimburse something that's not FDA approved for that indication. So FDA approval is really important, and off-label use is something that they are looking into. Okay, so that is basically what you need to know about regulatory pathways. To summarize, you can go through either the 510K or the PMA process unless exempt. Every manufacturer has to register with the FDA, list their medical device. They have to go through quality system regulation. They're subject to labeling requirements, and they have to report any adverse events with their medical device. And that is it. Thank you.